Okay, so today's video, we're going to talk about how you can do certain exercise protocols to impact your hormone profile. And when I say hormone profile, to optimize our hormone profile, what we want to do is we want to raise anabolic hormones or optimize anabolic hormone production, and we want to decrease catabolic hormones like cortisol. And so the way to do that, we've got 7 things that research shows us that can impact our hormone profile. And so there may be other things that work, and there are some supplements and things out there that I may have mentioned before that work a little bit here and there for certain things, like ashwagandha is really good for lowering cortisol levels. But these are 7 things that are specific exercise protocols that have been shown to be effective for increasing anabolic and decreasing catabolic hormones. So number 1, the first thing is using multi-joint movements. So when you use a multi-joint movement like powerlifting and Olympic lifting, you're using muscles across multiple joints, and so you're using a large surface area of the body. So those movements that are using a large percentage of the muscles in the body are going to be more, not only more metabolic, but they're going to be more anabolic. The body's going to dump out more anabolic hormones to repair those tissues. The second protocol is working larger muscle groups. The larger the muscle, the more anabolic hormones get pumped out. There was a study that showed, it was a crossover study. They had individuals do biceps curls, and then they checked the testosterone levels, and there was no increase. Then in the crossover, they had them do leg extensions on a different day, and then biceps curls afterwards. And then after doing the leg extensions, they actually saw a spike in testosterone, so using those larger muscle groups. Now, because they activated the biceps as well after, the biceps was able to benefit from the binding of those testosterone hormone molecules, okay? So that was the second one. The third one is going to be lifting heavier weight or heavy weights. Now, a lot of people say, well, I don't want to get big and bulky. You know, the reality is this, and I get this really mainly from females. Generally a female, unless there's some imbalance or excessive production of testosterone or some exogenous agent that you're putting into your body, you're generally not going to get big and bulky. So that being said, again, it's also relative, right? What is heavyweight for you may be different than for me, different for somebody else. So, but when you lift heavyweight, what you do is you recruit more muscle fibers, so a larger number of muscle fibers, and that larger number of muscle fibers, again, gives a greater surface area that you're activating, and your body's going to dump out more anabolic hormones for repair. Now, even though planks and things like that are really good isometric type exercises, and they can be very difficult, those type of isometric exercises do not stimulate increase in the anabolic hormones. Things like as you load heavier weight for a bench press, that will, because you're loading a larger percentage of muscle fibers at the same time, and what that's going to do again is give you that better hormone response or a bigger hormone response. Okay, number 4, high intensity interval training. There's many different ways to do this, but essentially any kind of training where you spike your heart rate and then you kind of go about 90% and then have an active rest. 90% and active rest. One of the things I like to use as an example are sprints. You sprint and you walk back. You sprint and you walk back, and you do that in an interval type series. They did a study where they compared kettlebell snatch, so kettlebell snatch intervals. Okay, they compared that to running, and kettlebell snatch intervals burnt calories equivalently to running a 6-minute mile over a 20-minute period of time. So 20 minutes of kettlebell snatch, interval type style, and 20 minutes of running a 6-minute mile burns the same amount of calories. You actually will activate more muscle groups and more metabolism with the kettlebell training, which we can see in other facets. It wasn't specifically in that study, but again, you're going to activate a lot more muscle groups because you're activating lower and upper. With the running, it's pretty much lower extremity activation. And so they're both good, but again, you see some differences there in the interval training giving increased metabolism, but also our body generally dumps out more growth hormone, and so that tends to help as well. We spike that real high 90% with the active rest. We get a better growth hormone response usually. Okay, so that was number 4. Number 5 is decreasing time between sets. They did a study. They did a 60-second, a 90-second, and a 120-second rest period, and they found out at the 120-second rest period we get the best testosterone response. At 60 seconds, the best growth hormone response, and 90 was somewhere in between. So that range of 60 seconds to 120 seconds is a good range of rest period between your sets. Now, if you're doing, you can do shorter rest sets, okay? But when you're doing large muscle groups or things like squats or deadlifts or things like that, you generally want to have, a rest period still probably within that 1 and 2 minutes, but you don't want to shorten it to about 30 seconds or less. You can do that when you're doing things like smaller muscle groups like biceps, triceps, things like that, isolated muscle groups. Then you can do shorter rest periods, especially when you're not loading, the body with weight, things like that. So there's a fatigue factor there that can impact not only your technique, but potential injury, things like that. So that was, let's say that was 5. Number 6 is keeping your workouts under 60 minutes. Now I will be honest with you, I don't do that. My average workout's probably about an hour and 30 minutes. But at 60 minutes, what happens around there, it's not a hard science, but around there, and they did this long ago in studies, is they find that testosterone continues to spike as cortisol spikes, and about 60-ish minutes, testosterone starts to decline and cortisol spikes even further. And so cortisol being catabolic, it breaks things down. Testosterone anabolic builds things up, right? So we want to minimize the cortisol, optimize testosterone. So we don't want to go too far past that hour mark if possible. Now I understand this is impossible for athletes to do. Sometimes training sessions last for hours. And there's other ways to try and mitigate that. Something I don't have specifically in my notes, but it is found in research that carbohydrates after an hour period and throughout a long-standing workout or training session will blunt cortisol spikes, so it'll blunt the cortisol response somewhat. So there's ways to try and mitigate that if you have to do longer workouts or do a split routine where you do part workout here and then part workout later in the day. And so there's ways to do that. The last thing is to take in some good post-workout carbohydrates and protein. So about 30 grams of protein and about, or I usually say between 25 and 40, but about 30 grams of protein and then about 60 grams of carbohydrates gives you a nice spike in insulin, because what's going to happen, the types of carbohydrates you're going to want to use if you're using the carbohydrates are going to be high glycemic carbohydrates, so carbohydrates that will spike your blood sugar quickly, which is what we never ever want to do unless it's at the end of a workout, because now we've depleted our muscles of glycogen and we've got to get the sugar back into the muscle. So when we spike the blood sugar, it sucks that glucose back into the muscle and recreates the glycogen in the muscle again, and so that's a really good effect. And it also spikes insulin, and insulin is one of our anabolic hormones. So our 4 primary anabolic hormones that I talk about are testosterone, growth hormone, insulin-like growth factor 1, and then insulin. Insulin is also not just to shuttle the sugar into the cells, but it's also an anabolic hormone, and you'll get that. Now they do find that even if you do no carbohydrates, let's say you want to be leaner, right? You're just kind of looking for leanness. You don't want to do those extra carbohydrates because you don't want the extra calories. Taking amino acids post-workout or like a whey protein shake or something like that will, because it's a very quick release of amino acids into the system, relatively speaking. And so those amino acids will cause the release of insulin as well, so you'll still get that insulin response. Those carbohydrates post-workout, though, or at the hour mark, will blunt that cortisol, as I mentioned before. So those are 7 strategies. I've also talked about the 4 anabolic hormones, cortisol being our primary catabolic hormone. And so if you have any questions on that, let me know. Stay strong. I'll see you next time. Oh, and I wore the appropriate shirt for today.